Okay.
On peut faire le test sans que ce soit avec tout le monde, je sais pas.
Ben, c'est ça, en fait, c'est ce qu'il m'a dit de faire jusque-là, donc j'attends. Je pense que c'est encore sur mute de leur côté.
Ouais. Ah oui, non, il me présente. Comment il s'appelle?
Chiv,
il me présente, je n'ai pas besoin de me présenter.
Il me semble que je ne suis pas sûre. Hein. Je pense que ça vient directement sur toi, il me semble, hein, qu'ils n'ont pas cette option-là.
J'ai marqué stop.
Ok. Donc en fait, il y a deux systèmes. Il y a le système Skype et le système Hangouts. Le système Skype, c'est vraiment pour les Chinois qui n'arrivent pas à se connecter sur Gmail et tout ça.
D'accord.
Donc en fait,
donc maintenant, on est sur Gmail. Ouais.
Donc là, on est
on a deux systèmes de fois, c'est ça.
Donc, là,
oui, donc on est sur aucun système particulier de Colombien, donc on est tous sur les global plateformes. C'est les gens qui sont déjà mis.
Désolée.
Je ne savais pas si tu étais équipé cette challenge. Il y en a beaucoup.
C'est aussi la salle 1 qui fonctionne.
Oui, la salle 1 que j'ai déjà utilisée. Et puis,
La salle
13 et 4.
Et les amphis aussi, bien sûr.
Les amphis. Et c'est utilisé souvent, je crois que ça a du temps.
Régulièrement, ouais. Avec les États-Unis principalement, l'Angleterre, beaucoup l'Afrique aussi. Important sur plusieurs pays d'Afrique.
Donc, je vais juste mettre pour le moment, parce que j'ai l'impression qu'on nous voit déjà, donc je vais mettre sur le slide comme ça. Donc, en fait, là, tu vois un petit peu ce qui va se passer. Attends, non.
Et moi, il y a 10 minutes, c'est à peu près.
Il y a un décalage. Hein. C'est pour ça que je préfère que tu vois ça, que tu vois ça. Il y a un petit, c'est ça, exactement.
Non, non, ça c'est simple. En plus, je l'ai sous le nez, je vois bien.
Ok, so là, present to everyone. Et a priori. Alors, je pense qu'on a à peu près 2 minutes, même pas. On peut commencer apparemment quand on veut.
Je crois qu'on dirait maintenant.
Bah, tu vois, j'essaie de laisser donc ça quelques minutes.
Bon, là, il faut qu'on commence avec ce qu'on voit. Au moins, je propose que je prenne de l'eau.
Il y en a ici?
T'as des retours là, ils ont du fun de notre côté?
Bah, apparemment, on va commencer, voir si ça marche. Si c'est bon, bah, je te remercie pour tout.
Start. Et tu starts sur qu'on voit, non?
Alors tu me dis quand c'est bon, on y va.
Il faut qu'il n'y ait pas trop de bruit.
Okay, we'll start in 1 minute. All right, guys, we're going to start in 1 minute.
Ok,
On y va?
On y va.
D'accord.
Et tu le remettras après.
C'est ça, quand tu doutes, dès que tu me dis. Ok, donc on fait stop.
Je peux y aller? Hello everyone. I'm very pleased to meet you this afternoon. Currently, I am a professor at Columbia University and at Sciences Po. But this year is a particular year for me, as I have been appointed the special representative for the French government to prepare the conference of the party of the Climate Convention to prepare the agreement in Paris in 2015. So this year is about not doing my normal job, but more trying to help facilitate a process which has been complex for many years, but now has to be really achieved. So I think we will look around this lecture about the context and about the necessity of really meeting, drafting an agreement and understanding what we can do to fit in the global carbon budget that we decided in Cancun. But understanding the difficulties and the process, and I will try to convey you to a reflection to see how we can get there and what we have to build in Paris to put the world back on track on this trajectory. So we will look at my slides now and maybe to remind us of the context of this discussion. The recent IPCC reports confirms us that climate change is a major threat, that there is no more doubt about that today, and many countries now are feeling already the impacts of climate change. And to do so, to try to stay within the carbon budget for respecting the rise in temperature of 2 degrees that we decided internationally in Cancun in 2010, doing so will require deep decarbonization and profound transformation of most country economies. This technical, operational, financial, and political aspect of the deep decarbonization for the moment are not being addressed with the necessary urgency and priority. That's why the preparation for COP21 in 2015, that for the moment and because of the political context, the capacity of the world to agree on something is focused on the bottom-up pledges, because it was not possible when we started this negotiation that has to finish by 2015 to agree on a distribution of a carbon budget from top down. So that's why we are in our hands this system where countries would propose pledges everyone, but this is unlikely to lead us to a 2-degree world. So at the same time, we have there a contradiction. We know that our goal is 2 degrees, not to raise mean temperature by more than 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial level, but at the same time, the regime we have, the regime even we construct for 2015, is unlikely, if we keep it like it is, to lead us to a 2-degree world. So I would walk you through the thinking of how we can make this happen. So coming back to the 2 degrees, why 2 degrees? It's not a scientific commitment. It's a political commitment. The idea, because the ultimate objective of the UNFCCC, that is the Convention on Climate Change, to combat climate change, is to achieve the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And this is about this qualification of the danger, which is, of course, conduct the global community to try to decide on what is dangerous, what is agreed as a common danger. The Cancun Agreement recognized that deep cuts in global GHG emissions are required according to science, and as documented in IPCC IR4, which is a previous report of IPCC, so has to hold the increase in global average temperature below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So in Cancun, we agree that the danger, the definition of danger, was to agree on the 2 degrees. When you look at this IPCC IR5, which is now to be completed this year, and the executive summary would be finalized the next Friday, this report confirms the risk of exceeding the 2 degrees in global mean temperature. And the danger there is qualified looking at the extreme weather events, the strengthening of systems, the distribution of impact, and you see that now it's everyone and that now the intensity of the impact is very high. There are global aggregate impacts and the larger scale singular events. So the idea is that which the white or yellow zone, which are moderate, are now all these qualification of the dangers are now turning to the red on the violet, which is high and very high. Some leading scientists say that 2 degrees is far too dangerous, that 1 degree limit should be preferable, and even small island states are argued that 1.5 limit was the only capacity for their islands to survive. And in many cases, of course, when you look at the impact of what the 2 degrees global warming would make as an impact, you see that in particular for the sea level rise or many other events, the small territories, more fragile, are really threatened. So some scientists like Hansen, Jim Hansen, has published many articles to say that 2 degrees already would cause major dislocation for civilization, and that we should argue we should really fight for a 1 degree target, because it is more normal, that is more closer to climate variation that have been experienced in further period. That's a recent 10,000 years. It makes it likely that the biosphere and the soil would be able to sequester a substantial proportion of the CO2 and not, of course, emit them, not be able to sequestrate it. The Cancun Agreement could not agree on such a very sort of ambitious target, and but recognize the need to consider that we may have to strengthen the long-term goal, global goal, and go back to 1.5. So the general conversation these days is about how we are on track or not, and how we put us on track for the 2 degrees, meaning that we don't abandon an improvement of this long-term goal of 1.5 degrees, because in particular of the situation of fragile territories like the small island states. COP21 in Paris is the last chance to take the 2 degrees target seriously, not because I don't want to play the catastrophic, give a catastrophic impression, but we know that we are lagging behind the necessary pathway to get there. And some already are arguing that the 2 degrees is impossible to achieve And you see that in many reports, in many publications. Very few countries, but at the same time, very few countries, and not even the largest emitters, I can think about USA or China or India, haven't looked seriously at the 2 degrees national pathway. So many have looked at how they can improve, reduce their emission, have emissions that grow much more slowly, depending on the development levels of their political consideration. But there was no really, if not Europe, who has really designed a roadmap consistent with a 2 degrees target. Nobody has done that really. But at the same time, there is no plan B. There is no natural backup agreement if the 2 degrees C fails. The world will not agree, I think that's my conviction, to a 2.5 degrees target. So it's not, we cannot do 2 degrees, so let's go for another global goal. Is or we make the 2 degrees, or we have a way, a plan to really be consistent with 2 degrees, or in reality, everybody would just say that it is impossible to really fight seriously climate change. So the political, economic, and social and environmental cost of abandoning the 2 degrees target would be devastating. At least that's really a strong assumption that most countries, and even recently I listened to many countries, China, US, India in particular, that 2 degrees should not be abandoned. So when we translate that, of course, it's not a precise science, it's about probabilities. IPC RR5, in the summary of policymakers of the Working Group 1, which is really the science of climate, says that limiting the warming caused by anthropogenic CO2 emissions alone to less than 2 degrees C since pre-industrial level, with a likely, that's a probability, 66% chance, will require cumulative CO2 emission from all anthropogenic sources, there are of course all other sources, to stay below 1,000 gigaton. So the equivalent of 3,060-70 gigaton CO2 equivalent. When accounting from non-CO2 forcings, this carbon budget is even reduced to 790 gigaton. An amount of 515 gigaton in 1890 has already been emitted by 2011. So we have already exhausted a big part of our budget. The global carbon budget for CO2, for the 2 degrees C budget, that means that the remaining carbon budget we have in front of us is 275 gigaton. This is normally the carbon budget we should distribute between all the countries. And accounting for warming effects of increases in non-CO2 greenhouse gases, reduction in aerosol, or the release of the greenhouse gases from permafrost, which is of course caused by the even warmer temperature, could further reduce the global carbon budget. So this says the budget is 275 is still really a carbon budget that we should be keep on. So as we are adding approximately 10 gigaton per year to the atmosphere, and the BIU, the carbon budget would be exhausted in less than 30 years. So if we look at our global trajectory to stay within the 2C carbon budget, we have, of course, different plausible trajectories. So the ultimate objective is certainly to go to net zero emission before the end of the century. That's now a way of translating what RR5 IPCC report is telling us on this global trajectory. So we should, before being a net zero emission from the 50 gigaton of CO2 equivalent today, we should be lower in 2020, 44 gigaton, to go even lower in 2030, and to be at around 22 gigaton of CO2 equivalent by 2050. That is more or less halving the emission of today by 2050. Of course, that's a reasonable, consistent with science trajectory we should follow as a global trajectory. And if we look more from energy, then we know that energy emission, CO2 energy emission, has to fall from 36 gigaton today up to 16 gigaton by 2050. And per capita emissions, which is in a way a very practical way of understanding what we should do, CO2 energy should fall from 4.9, the level we are today, to 1.6. So in a way, that's a big transformation we have to organize if we want to stay within the 2C carbon budget. And again, for example, if you compare the carbon intensity of the GDP, the energy emission per $1,000 of world GDP has to fall from 390 kilos to around 50. So again, a total transformation of the economy. And that's one of the graphs you will see in many reports. So is really the BIU conduct us to something around more to 4 degrees, and we have then to really change the trend of the economy. And in particular, this last year, I've seen a very rapid increase of global emissions. So what do we need? We need to think things totally differently. Not to look for incremental transformation, but to look at major transformation, in particular of the energy system, which is at the core of these emissions of greenhouse gases, even if land use and forests always, of course, and agriculture participates also. But carbon and energy system are at the core because they are at the core of the economy in reality. What we need to do is a massive improvement of energy efficiency in all sectors, but we have as well to have a complete decarbonization of the power sector. We cannot imagine that electricity in 2050 and even more at the end of the century could not be almost completely decarbonized. This means as well, because we have to decarbonize the energy consumption, that electrification of final energy use is very important, in particular for transport and for heating, for housing and industry. So the idea that we have to shift to low carbon energy carriers or vectors is a central element of the transformation of the energy systems. We have to look at emission reduction or carbon capture in industry, in agriculture, and to understand what can be captured and sequestrated, what has to come from reduction on the two sides, the industry and the biology, meaning land use, agriculture and forestry. So the interesting thing is very few countries have looked at in detail as long-term scenario implying national decarbonization. There are low-carbon economy strategies that have been studied since Copenhagen, 2009, and Cancun, but never, or only very few number of countries with an objective to fit with the 2 degrees. And in part, the global model and pathways which are available do not adequately address the key challenges. One, because it has some very specific sectoral elements that are not looked at, like the role of the power sector. Sometimes we have to consider that not every country will agree on the same decarbonization options. That's the question, for example, around nuclear. That's the same about carbon capture and sequestration. Some countries are very hostile about CCS. Some countries are very hostile about nuclear. Some, at the contrary, doesn't want to get rid or think that they can have a future without fossil fuels. So, of course, they are tending to think the decarbonization in terms of carbon capture and sequestration. There are, of course, a number of discussions that has to be developed on the economics of the decarbonization. And depending, of course, on the local endowment, it's just not the same concern and issues if you are Canada, Australia, or China, or if you are a small island which can live from 100% renewable energy. So there is, of course, the political discussion is, of course, relying very much on the national context and the perspective the countries has on their future. But we have to consider, even if these 2 degrees C imply that you have to have a long-term vision of your economy, nevertheless, the work has not been done. And this is a major barrier towards the global climate agreement. If we want this global climate agreement to be serious and be consistent with the global goal. So that's why, together with the Earth Institute, the Sustainable Development Solution Network, and my institute, IDRI at Sciences Po, we launched a project to help the negotiation figure out, even if we cannot finish the job by 2015, how put countries to consider a different vision of the development, and not negotiation on short-term targets, but more having and communicating about the long-term vision. So exploring national pathways to 2050 consistent with the 2C global carbon budget is absolutely, in our view, very important. And I would detail that, explaining to you how I see a global agreement in Paris, understanding what can be done on the short term, but introducing in the agreement a long-term perspective, which in my view is the logic of shifting from targets, which has been the normal way of negotiating in this convention and these different elements of the climate negotiation, to have a view on the development pathways that can embed deep decarbonization in their development. So the idea is to explore national pathways consistent with the 2C global carbon budget, which you've seen is very limited already. That can be understood on the technology side, that what kind of technology this is implied, that we can understand from the dynamic and the transformation within each sector, and are consistent with physical constraints. Of course, you can imagine to capture every CO2 from fossil fuel, from the burning of fossil fuel, but if you don't have the capacity to store, it doesn't mean anything. So that's the same for the technical potential for renewable. We know that, for example, some countries have a lot of potential in solar and wind, and some are very little. So this has, of course, we should not just think in the void, in the abstract. We have to deal with the physical constraint as well. And at the same time, we have to provide a basis for socio-economic impact analysis and policy implementation, just because I have said you previously, some countries have specific choices of how they see their own economic and energy development. Just an example, and I will now accelerate a little on these examples, but it's interesting to see that in some countries, in particular states like California, I think is still the 8th economy at world level, so it's not a small economy, has looked at what it means to have a deep decarbonization to be around 2 tons per capita at the end by 2050. And you see that it is really about doing many things in many sectors. Energy efficiency being, of course, as you see in the blue line, the blue segment, quite very important. A very important part, electricity decarbonization, that is having electricity out of renewable energy or carbon capture and sequestration, to have really, of course, more intelligent processes, industrial processes, to have solar, decentralized solar, biofuels, non-energy, non-CO2, and which are the emission we have to decrease. That's about land use, and a certain amount of transforming the use of energy through electrification to allow for clean electricity to replace polluting energy. So the details are not that interesting, but you see that a decarbonization scenario is about thinking in many sectors, many differences, and at the same time, it's a systemic choice. It's not you do something about energy efficiency and you let the rest of the system without intervention. You have to organize. If you, for example, push for the electrification of the consumption of energy, then you have, of course, to provide for clean electricity to allow for that. But we see that there are mainly very, very big pillars which were reflected in this wage. Energy efficiency, which is the utmost important movement that every country has to really look for. Decarbonization, the electricity generation, and electrifying the system. So these three pillars, in technology and economic terms, you will find them in many cases, in most of the decarbonization scenario. In a way, even if countries are different, if their contexts are different, what is interesting to see in the California example, what we could find in many other countries, there is a specificity of countries, but at the same time, there is global challenges. And because we are in integrated economies, a chance of having common and global solution to the specific problems at each level. What is at stake in Paris? In a way, it's simple. So you see, what is needed is what I show with this deep decarbonization scenario by 2050 and to get to net zero emission by the end of the century. So how we organize that? It's not a treaty that will deliver this, of course. It's broader, but is something like aligning all the expectation of all actors that this deep decarbonization scenario, and of course, where it is analyzed and explained and discussed, is really represented the future evolution of the economy. Because what is happening today is that most of the economic actors and even consumers and citizens doesn't believe that this future of the low carbon economy is there, that will happen. So in a way, the first element of what I would like to see in Paris in the 12th of December, that is on the morning, hopefully after we finish our work, would be the signals, the economic and political signals are all in favor of the low carbon economy. All the indicators are on the right side. And so what it is about the alignment of expectation of government, of local authorities, of businesses, consumer and citizens. It is about an agreement that is giving the discipline to the countries that this will happen. How we do that? This is not simple. Because why is not simple? So the result is simple. What we are looking for is a signal that this is the low carbon economy is underway, but at the same time, the notion of a centralized emission of an idea that we have a central signal that of course was initially thought due in the Kyoto Protocol framework was we have a global carbon price that will send this signal across the whole economy and the whole global economy. And now, of course, we know we will not have that because the Kyoto mechanism didn't function. It was not finally the framework where all countries would like to gather around because we could not distribute a global carbon budget. So we don't have a price, which is a result of the needs of the different countries around a market and around a distribution of emissions rights. So we don't have that. We don't have a centralized signals. And the signals that we could do with timetables and targets with a global carbon price is no more there to do the job. So we have to look differently at how we can get this. And that's why the way we envisage the Paris Agreement, the Paris Compact, is basically fundamentally with two pillars. One is the agreement between governments, which is what primarily the government of France has to deliver together with all the other parties, is to deliver an agreement, a legal agreement. We decided in Durban to launch that negotiation, to have a legally binding or an instrument with a legal force by 2015, binding government to really engage all of them in policies that reduce emissions and then comply with the global goal, the ultimate goal of the convention. But at the same time, we have to distribute the signal across the economy, and this distribution of the signal will not come alone by the agreement between government, but will come from all the other actions that are there that can support the UNFCCC agreement, and in particular, a cross-cutting innovation and research development agenda. So let's talk about a little about the UNFCCC agreement. This legal agreement is on processes, and that is still what is remained from the top-down elements. And there is an element which are not top-down, which are the contribution of the countries, which are the bottom-up piece of this agreement of Paris. The legal agreement, what we are looking for? We are looking for a discipline of countries, to discipline the countries that they commit to mitigate their emissions, with leaving them the liberty of saying how they would do that and with what level of ambition. But in the legal agreement, then, we will inscribe a mechanism to ratchet up this contribution to account with the same accounting, but to make countries to commit to every time to come back with better contribution, better targets along the time. And in a way, what we are looking for, consistent with what I said previously, is to, in this legal agreement, and still I don't know if we will get it, have asked countries to commit to study seriously their long-term pathways and come back regularly to discuss and analyze what these deep decarbonization pathways could look like. So the legal agreement, which will be on processes, would define the roadmap of the work plan of the countries, without, of course, giving precise indications on the level of ambition that the country should have. It's not that clear, because in the legal agreement, we would like to, of course, express that the more developed countries and the countries that really are transition and are really emerging countries, for example, has more responsibility to give strong to define strong targets and to really explain quite well what they are planning to do. But at the same time, the other piece of the agreement is about pledges by nations that are free to determine how they would craft them. In the legal agreement, and that's what we are trying to define by Lima already, that is in December, next December, is what should be the substance of these contributions, the bottom-up part. So we have to define, that will be finished by Paris, to define the top-down elements, but we have to define as well in Lima before the context, the content of the bottom-up piece. And this is quite important, but because again, if we come back to one of my elements of what I'm looking for Paris, which is how we give a signal to the economy that the low carbon economy is there, is underway, then what I have in hand is how countries can explain through their national policies, through their, of course, their numbers, the numbers of mitigation in particular they would propose, and with a timetable they would propose, how they would implement these numbers, how the policies would look like. That is part of the signal which I think can be expressed in the bottom-up piece of the Paris Agreement. The mitigation contribution, still, I think we have to work that we go for this, we look for this fundamental shift from the logic of targets to a logic of pathways. Under the logic of pathways, countries would submit long-term indicative low-emission pathways combined with operational multi-sector, multi-frame target package. And because we have this 4 levels of uncertainty, that's why we try to secure countries or to give a repetitive exchange of information, a learning process between countries, that this level of uncertainty get down. We have to address this uncertainty differently. Of course, the first utmost important uncertainty is this discussion, which is really fascinating, about the level and the structure of the future economic activity. Take a country like Australia, for example. For Australia, imagine a future in 2050 and beyond, which is not relying on the exploitation of natural resources is very difficult. And at the same time, if we go for a really low carbon economy, if China will reduce its imports of coal from Australia because China wants to reduce coal consumption inside its country, then the future for Australia should be different. The same for China. For the moment, it is a country based really on industry, and heavy industry in particular, in manufacture. China is thinking, and now for many years, how to change that structure and to go for an economic structure which allow for much more services to provide for the economic growth and much less polluting activity. So this reflection of the structure of the future economic activity is uncertain, but it is an uncertainty that every country has to work on and in a way communicate to others. Of course, the second one, which is classically the one we are trying to deal with in the agreement, in all agreements or in the international community, is uncertainty about action of others, because you don't want to lose your competitiveness, and why it is, of course, to get out of the prisoner dilemma. So that's a type of uncertainty that is quite easy to reduce if we have a certain discipline inscribed, embedded in the agreement. But we have more level of uncertainty, and that's the more innovative ones. The first one is about having a discussion about the future, and try to see how this combines with the global planet where we live really together. The second one is relatively easy to deal with, and the two other ones are more new to understand. How is this happening really? How we can understand that really, yes, the cities have a serious plan of decarbonization, that transport will be changed, that we have this movement, like we see some, of course, transformation in the economy, but the perception that it's not a minority is beginning to be a majority of the economic sectors. And that is, to try to measure the transformation is certainly very important to combat inertia. So understanding and formulating the signal of the serious decarbonization against a perception that really the change is not there is certainly something we have to work at, about communication, measuring, transparency, and many others. And there is another final level, which is, do we have the technologies? Are we able to afford to buy them? Are they affordable? Will it be there when we understand the deep nature of the transformation we have to make? We will have this technology available. So I think we should have an agreement that try to address with different elements these four levels of uncertainty. So the plan is to combine the short-term and the long-term perspective through a combination of short-term targets and aspirational long-term pathways, and to try to align the domestic policy processes and international negotiation through collective predictable expectation about future negotiation cycle. For me, the management of time would be an essential element of trying to harmonize this discussion, who are basically and fundamentally domestic discussion, but at the same time having an international place where you can discuss these moves, these elements, this evolution of the domestic policies. And because there are inertia embedded in infrastructure, updating near-term targets by setting new targets for the next period is essential. For example, in 2020, it would make very little sense to adjust the 2025 targets, because that most of the drivers of this emission would be there already. Rather, new ambition and reduction opportunities should be expressed by more ambitious 2030 and 2035 targets. So this sort of rolling targets are essential, again, to give visibility to the economic actors and not to lock in emission. It's a very interesting discussion we have in particular with the US government. US can deliver, because of the policies they have in hand, in particular on the presidency side, a 2025 target. But at the same time, if you wait 2020 to define, in 2025 to define, or 2020 to define 2030 target, most of the time the driver of this 2030 emission would have been already embedded in the infrastructure. So that's very specific to US case, but to have a view, and that's the discussion we are opening, that maybe, of course, it's not a commitment, but it is a vision of the future evolution that is necessary to be discussing very early. So having not really be forced to have only short-term targets, but having a vision is, of course, the logic we are trying to embed. And I think progressively it was quite a success in the ongoing discussion. But we need to keep a 2C target as a global goal, because we need a direction of travel. We need to assess progress against global and national contribution. It's a risk management approach that should really be embedded in the discussion. And we have, in a way, to establish an even more strong relation with IPCC conclusion to just reassess trajectory and to see how IPCC reports see as a global 2C trajectory as a direction reference point. So updated contributions, the approach for a dynamic agreement should address three challenges: combining the short term and the long term, aligning domestic policy processes and international negotiation, and reflect the inertia. So it's basically about the idea of having rolling targets, having a target year, but then having a second more not a commitment and an obligation, but something like a vision perspective. And this is, of course, giving the low emission pathway to 2050 more and more precision and more commitment. Finally, of course, these contributions are different because of the level of development of countries. And of course, that's a traditional discussion of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability in our jargon. And we know that now in Kyoto and of course all developed countries, when you look at the Copenhagen and Cancun pledges in 2009 and 2010, most of the developed countries, everyone, have given economy-wide target relative to a predefined base year period, 1990 for Europe, 2005 for US, for example, or for some others like Australia. And there was aspirational peaking targets as well, that peak years for most of them. This could be a group of countries or a group or a category of commitments that should stay. And the idea we are discussing actually in the negotiation is that the countries that are already or can do economy-wide will never backslide to another more ambitious, less ambitious type of commitments, like relative, for example, relative economy-wide targets like carbon intensity, for example, or emissions per capita, or against defined business as usual scenarios. So when you are in the tier one, or you try, every country try to be in the tier one, and the one who are already there, no downsides, don't of course weaken their contribution for the next period. And the tier two is the countries that cannot, for the moment, because of the uncertainty, mainly because the uncertainty of the structure of the economy, are giving more, and because they doesn't mean they want or they need to increase their emission for a while, give carbon intensity target or per capita targets. And you can have even a CR3, which is not incompatible with the two first one, by the way, which is giving information and indicators, benchmarks on quantitative and qualitative sectoral indicators, and target or policies organized around the major emitting sector. And this comes, of course, a notion of explaining the policies by sector, which is quite important because it gives as well a very strong signal to the rest economy and the businesses in particular. But I would like I want not to avoid to spare time to speak about the second pillar. I call this a flute player. The first pillar is about disciplining the countries, giving time and rules for the countries to submit their contribution. And of course, have spoken only about mitigation, haven't spoken about technology, really about adaptation, about finance, well, different chapters of this agreement, but I focus today on mitigation. And then the metaphor I use for the protocol, the new protocol or for the contribution is about having a sheepdog, that every country has to be disciplined and has to converge in the same travel direction. And we really trying to improve each time the contribution. The second pillar is totally different, is the non-government actors, and they are absolutely totally different. There are the cities or the subnational authorities like the region, take California for example, the businesses acting in local or global value chains, discussion for example of the consumer industry in the forest sector, financial institutions, how much financial institutions like private banks, commercial banks, insurance companies are investing in the low carbon economy and disinvesting in the brown economy. That's the same question for the national development banks. Do a BNDES in Brazil, which is a very powerful development bank, invest more in the clean economy than in the brown economy? And so you could, in a way, read the plans and the policies of every one of these institutions, whatever businesses or more public, like development banks, or more private, and ask if their expectation as well are converging with the low carbon economy. Is that much more on trying to organize the signals around with their own what their action are doing, and to try to see if there is a connection between this and how this will be connected to the formal agreement itself. Because at the end of the day, we have to amplify the signal given by the government by the second pillar, which is a signal given by the non-government actors. I can take a very simple example. If the cities of the region, before Paris or after Paris, have a platform where they can explain what they plan to do about their emission reduction, about the transformation of their system in electricity, in transport, in heating, etc. That's the same for the region. You see California having a plan of really reducing emission by 85 or 80% by 2050. The California plan is a very important signal. One, big for California, for US, because it's doing much better or planning to do much better than the US are prepared to do for the moment. It's explaining how it wants to do it. And this gives a signal for other countries or other regions that if California does it, that makes sense. Maybe that makes a lot of sense. So that amplifies the signal. So the idea is to have all these actors explaining their actions, trying to measure the impact of this action, and trying to, in a way, reinforcing the signal. And we begin to have an instrument. It's a very new thing, because before that we could understand that it was almost impossible to connect the formal discussion within UNFCCC and the outside world. It was almost impossible. Now we have even an initiative or an emerging notion that we should have a platform built-in within the formal agreement that allow for these actors not to be part of the negotiation between the government, but to report and potentially to be accountable of their converging effort for the same goal, which is a 2°C goal. And that's what we are trying to build, and we could have this discussion in a moment. So how to organize that discussion? I think it's not that simple, of course, but we have, in a way, some elements of common understanding, a common matrix to do so. And one, I think, is a time. At least if we have a process where each 5 years we assess our actions. We see how everyone has contributed to the goal and the difficulties. We envisage how much the progress is being done, the technology cost is being lowered by initiative of the different ones. We see then this 5 years time could give a sort of rhythm to not only government meeting points, but as well meeting point for companies, for cities as well. There is another element is about what I call the risk disclosure. It has many meanings in reality. One is that you disclose the risks that the impact of climate change, how the impact of climate change is affecting your activity or may affect your activity. And that's and there are now many reports that try to feature that, that really what businesses, public sector is citizens are affected by the impact of climate change. And if we can begin to appreciate and exchange around that, that of course gives a value of the protection against climate change. That is mitigation mainly, even if adaptation policy would be central. But there is a risk, another risk we have to build in the discussion, a signal, which is if more and more countries, if more and more cities, if more and more businesses are trying to disinvest for the brown economy and going for the clean economy, there is an economic risk about the carbon content of economic activities. And there you feature a risk that begins to be a strong signal, hopefully added was expressed in a carbon price, but even if not, showing the movement that these different actors, whatever they are betting that the low carbon economy is the future, and that to be kept embedded in the brown economy, in the high carbon, is really dangerous from an economic point of view. And finally, I think the essential, an element, I think, of sharing, of organizing this melody out of this orchestra, which is produced, the melody being produced by different players, the government and the non-state actors, etc., is about sharing the long-term visions. It's because we learn how the technologies, how the transformation, how the policies can be envisaged in the long term, that we can have a concrete vision, not an abstract one through modeling and understanding how much carbon tons we have to really reduce, but what the economy in the future can look like. And it is about acting on a whole regime complex. And you see what I learned from all these negotiations from now a long time, and in this business since 1997, that you cannot act on one point. You have to act on the climate change negotiation, but you have to act on many other sectors. And that's why the notion of regime complex is particularly adequate to our job. I don't know how many signals we can produce by Paris, but certainly it's a broad signal. It will be part, the agreement itself, the numbers, and probably with, of course, a big gap still to be on track for the 2 degrees. It will be the business signal, the city signals, and hopefully the change in technology we are hoping for. And at Lima already would try to build this innovative mechanism to build a platform where this non-government signal could be harmonized, in particular in time and long-term vision and risk disclosure. That could be a unifying element for having all these players play something that everybody can understand. Thank you. Now I think we could switch to questions, if there is some time left.
So you might want to read the question, select it.
Okay, so I have a sort of, we have bundled the question, and thank you for doing that. We have a first question on which are the critical countries to lead the agreement, and the likelihood of them agreeing in a legally binding way, so we avoid a repeat of Kyoto. I think in the question, the leading, most critical countries are well identified. Is certainly US and China first, and India as a very important component that would define the level of ambition we can get. US and China because they are two major emitters, India being the third, and certainly none of them is really passionate advocacy for a very strong legally binding agreement. But they are feeling the pressure of the others. And the others are finally many. There are the smaller developing countries, the Africa, the Latin American countries, Europe. So they, of course, if we would design an agreement between these three, we will have an entirely probably bottom-up agreement with MRV systems and transparency, basically. With, of course, very nationally determined contribution of this in our jargon. But I think we will have more because of the global pressure and because we are in an integrated economy and because China, for example, or even India, doesn't want to be isolated in a world that really wants a more stringent agreement. Now, as a second question. So certainly the bilateral discussion is mainly with these three. And I think for the moment, the two big ones, the US and China, want an agreement in Paris. India is still to be seen what the new government would like to see. What policies could promote developing countries to bypass fossil fuel reliance and move to using more sustainable form of energy and in a way similar to technological leapfrogging with mobile technologies? That's a very good question as well. What do we have in hand? First, the problem is the cost of these technologies. So for developing countries, the issue is about making this technology affordable. Some are all, in some case, like for wind energy or solar energy or hydro, we are really in a zone of a lot of comparability in cost with fossil fuels. Not always, sometimes it's because investment is high and the cost of capital is still too high. But so the policies to promote that is not so much to go for very, very new technology for the moment, but to use this available technology with lowering the cost of the investment, the upfront capital which is needed, which is basically about credit, about access to capital, and about distribution of this technology. And it is underway. You see now many developing countries who have ambitious plans. Problems, of course, is still the storage of electricity and the grids, which is very expensive, sometimes very expensive for many countries. So we know the technology. I must say the major issue is about the cost of the upfront capital that I think should be allowed by a better functioning financial system, support from the multilateral development banks, and for the financial markets in general. So that I think is the major elements of reducing the upfront capital to allow for this leapfrogging. That could, by the way, give more energy security to many countries. I don't have, we have 2 minutes for a last question.
We have 10 minutes.
We have 10 minutes. Yeah. Oh, that's so we can have 2 or 3 more. Another question is about skepticism around climate change in a way. And the question read like this: even though climate change is a reality, there is still skepticism from many world powers to accept it. Is it possible to achieve an internationally coordinated approach to operationalize the 2 elements? And from the Universidad of Los Andes, Colombia. Colombia is a very active country in this discussion. And I really, I sense that it is very helpful to have Colombia in particular and Latin America in more general, really supporting a new vision of development pathway. Why I am relatively optimistic of the capacity of world powers to agree. One is because many world powers are now being afraid and concerned about the impact of climate change. And in New York, in the 23rd of September, there were many head of states, 120, that made declaration. All of them, from the bigger to the smaller countries, expressed their concern about the impact they observed now in their countries. So the skepticism is not so much to accept the idea or the reality of climate change, is about the capacity to change that, to really do something serious about that. And so, but the element of believing and observing and measuring the risk of the climate impacts is an essential component, an essential driver of a capacity to agree for an agreement. So, but I think this is totally different from what happened at Copenhagen and before. In Copenhagen, I would not have said that every country was really convinced about the impacts. The discussion was very much about the responsibility, the historical responsibility, was very much about for emerging countries to try to gain time, to resist to going in a different direction. When I look at the Chinese discussion nowadays, they are really very much concerned about the impact for their country. And they are now the main emitters. And in some years, not that far, 2030, they would even have emitted more than the whole developed country were from 1850. So they would be responsible not only on the flow, which they are today, but on the stock. And that is like they are punishing themselves because they are sensitive to climate change in a particular sense of desertification, of sea level rise, of extreme events. And you see many reports of the Academy of Science in China showing that, measuring it. So that, I think, is the main driver. And it's the same for US. The different reports that this actual Obama administration published on the risk of climate change for US and the already cost, I think that make a big difference. And see, of course, the way now that even in India, which of course is a country that of course is reluctant globally to engage in a very ambitious policy for the moment because they want to raise their emissions, when there was these major floods in Kashmir, in the Indian Kashmir, all the press in India reported that the impact of climate change. So I think that is the main driver of why countries would agree to. And the second driver is we cannot just do whatever we want by them ourselves. We are in a global movement. We don't want to be the laggers. And in a way, we want to finish this negotiation. We want to agree on something and to know where we are, what we are doing, and do we do that together. I think we feel that, and I think it's a strong feeling that you cannot have this, the EU market and the EU economies pointing to one direction, and it's still a big market for whole emerging countries, and other countries behaving totally differently. That would lead to trade conflicts, if more, and that would, I think, that's why I think the second driver is to be member of the international community. And the third one, which is the perception that maybe there are very good opportunities to go for a cleaner development. And again, take the example of China. Reducing the coal consumption in China is vital to get social peace, because citizens in the cities are not willing to stay in the situation of air pollution. They are huge collective costs, in particular on health. And so you see, there are a lot of drivers who are converging to, yes, an agreement is needed. I don't know if it will be mature enough to have it in Paris, The problem is everybody wants to finish this. That's indicate that we can probably agree for Paris as well. I think we can have maybe 2 more questions. And we are now entering in the discussion on finance. And an interesting question as well on noting the recent growth of the green bond market. To what extent do you see green bonds as an effective financial tool for transitioning to a low carbon energy driven economy, particularly given the potentially prohibitive cost of quality control? Thank you, Chris, for this question. It's a big question. For the moment, still, the green bond market is not a central element of what we see in the financial markets. They are growing. Of course, when you look at the increase, is very, very rapid. It's still a very small part of what the financial flows are about. And very diverse. You see companies, commercial banks, the content of these green bonds are not the same. They are very heterogeneous. And certainly we will have to have what sort of definition, categories, quality control, as you say. That will be absolutely necessary. If not, we will have a bubble very soon without knowing really what are these green bonds for. So I think one, it's a very good signal that the financial market are now testing waters to see if this is not only to look good and to have a good reputation, but it could be a new interesting market. And the reaction for the moment are interesting. Again, for the moment, you cannot conclude from the signal that it is big because it's beginning to be a very big market, and more because a number of actors, companies and banks in particular, want to test if for them it's easier to finance themselves for what they want to do by this way or compared to other type of financial instruments. But it is now, I think, by Paris, we will certainly have a movement of increasing with targets by 2020, for example, of really increasing different institutions announcing their plans to increase the emission of green bonds. So we have at least a sense of the quantity, and we certainly have to work on the quality. If not, if we don't work on the quality, I don't see a huge future, a beautiful future for this. But it could be a way of lowering the capital cost we need to raise for this clean economy, which basically, again and again, is about, for energy, about upfront capital. Last question, or maybe 2 more. We have 10 minutes more or 5 minutes more?
5 to 10.
5 to 10. The next question by Cristina Alvarez is, how can government address policies against climate change when in many cases there is no will to go against lobbies? Shouldn't lobbies have a formal role in negotiation? Interesting. I don't know what you're saying, by the way. I would be interested in having your response to that. How we can include the lobbies in the big powers, economic powers, in the discussion? Of course, the condition, in a way, they are in the discussion. Huh? They are behind governments. They want to be, and they are in a way, at least in informal dialogues. They are part of the discussion we have. The problem nowadays is probably that not a good solution, because they pressure, and they are not accountable of that pressure. I see with a lot of interest a number of companies. I think there is more 1,000 and more 1,500 that have signed up for having a carbon price. Who can decide to have a carbon price? Of course, not the companies. The companies can use a reference carbon price in their balance and to understand how this affects their economy and the activity and their investment. But the ones who have to decide the carbon price are the governments. And many times, including in my country, in France, you see that there are, of course, a lot of pressure against having it. So I think what I think would be interesting is to have these lobbies, these companies in particular, that want to participate in the discussion, enter in a discussion when then they would be accountable of their practices and their pressure on the governments. And still we don't have the mechanism to do so. So that's why I think there is this initiative of having the companies reporting to the agreement with a formula that could be they disclose their proposals, their commitments, for example, of emission reductions, or their technology offers, and there is a sort of accountability, an MRV, a measuring reporting process by a third party, because we have to introduce some kind of a discipline for them too. If you want to participate to a discussion, you should be accountable of what you are doing. If not, you are just having more space to pressure, and you pressure even more directly than what you do normally. So that's, I think, the challenge of this new governance that is really try in many agreements as well to introduce non-state actors in the discussion, because at the end of the day, they would be the ones that would implement many aspects of the agreements, but at the same time, having really them accountable of what they are doing. And that's what I don't have a solution, but I think we should work to a solution that they cannot express their views and want their views to be listened to if they are not accountable of their action as well. But I think there are ways. Now I think we have to cut down, and I'm sure we will have a good, everyone will have a good second hour discussion within your own classroom. And thank you to have listened. Bye-bye.